But even now, I feel like people are asking all the same set of wrong questions. Is AI a god or a slave? And I'm like, God, neither. This is why we're not asking the right questions, because the narratives out there are all either the sort of the Hollywood Terminator. AI wants to take over the world, rule humanity, and destroy humanity. And I'm like, well, a Skynet, Ex Machina, those are entertaining stories. They're kind of like the Frankenstein plot for the 20th century, Grimm's fairy tales almost, that kind of narrative structure, right? And so it's very entertaining because we're used to that structure. But at the same time, it cloaks the fact that the real danger is the way we're going right now is that humanity is going to end up destroying humanity before AIs even get a chance to. And that's because we're letting ourselves be just sort of unconsciously manipulated psychologically by the AI algorithms that power online social media and newsfeed algorithms, search and recommendation algorithms, and now chatbots. And we've given the AIs there the power of deciding, again, what we do and what we don't see. Like hundreds of times a day, we check our screens on these devices, all of us, and we're being shown things. But the algorithms online now have been put in charge sort of do I stay in the Midwest? Do I go to the coast? Do I go overseas? Do I see this culture or that culture? And the way they're doing it is actually polarizing us.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. I'm your host, Dov Baron. Everyone, for their own reasons, seems to be pretty intrigued by artificial intelligence. But what if AI that we've created isn't just a tool, but it's a reflection of our own humanity? Therefore, it would be flawed, it would be powerful, and it would be misunderstood. Could we be standing at the precipice of a new era, not just in technology, but in how we exist as a species? This is the Dov Baron Show, unmasking the hidden truths of high-profile thinkers. Tap into our community of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. This isn't just another podcast, it's an exploration into the minds of those who are shaping the world. Every episode is raw, unscripted, and it's a collaboration between my guests and myself as we dive into the truths that few dare to ask. We find guests for you who often are unknown to the general public, but are absolute titans in their field, the kind of people high-profile leaders turn to when they need their edge. Here, generous curiosity meets bold conversation. Expect a mix of playful irreverence and deep intellectual firepower that forces all of us to rethink what we thought we knew. If you're the kind of leader who craves depth over sound bites, hit that subscribe button, because this is where real thinkers come to sharpen their edge. For the next 2 episodes, we're joined by Professor Dakai, a titan in the field of artificial intelligence, who built the world's first global-scale online language translator. That's a precursor to what we know today as Google Translate and Microsoft Translate. Professor Dakai has been at the forefront of AI, natural language processing, and machine learning for over 4 decades. He is a founding fellow of computational linguistics and has held prestigious positions, including independent director of the Future Society and member of Google's inaugural AI Ethics Council, with joint appointments at Hong Kong UST, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and Berkeley International Computer Science Institute. Among other things, today he's going to be here to talk about his new book, which is called Raising AI. In today's episode, we'll uncover the hopes, the promises, and the potential risks of AI. So turn up the volume and help me welcome professor, musician, expert in ethics and society, music, AI, computational creativity, cognitive sciences, and the author of Raising AI, Professor Dakai. Welcome, sir.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. It is really an honor, and I'm looking forward to us getting into some of the things that are not usually talked about with AI. But where I always like to start is with the emotional source code of an individual. Nobody is who they are without a beginning. So what is the context we need to understand about your emotional source code that helps us to understand who we're actually having a convo with?
I think for me, having been born and raised in the Midwest, many years ago, and also traveling a lot because my parents took us all over the US, like road trip after road trip, and also internationally. And so from a young age, we got to see an awful lot of the world, different ways of thinking, and that sort of mind opening. They raised us multilingually. And so different ways that language encompass the way that we frame our realities. And you see how things can be looked at from all sorts of different angles. And that stimulates a curious mind about, well, how do you get down to the bottom of it? I think one of the things that really influenced me very heavily, although I didn't know it at the time, must have been 7 years old. My dad and I were biking and we took a break. He sat me down on the bench. We were on the sidewalk and watching the cars. And he said, "What color car do you think is the most popular color?" And I said, "Blue." He said, "Okay, well, I'm going to say white. So why don't we sit here and we'll count cars for the next 5-10 minutes and let's see." And we sat there happily counting cars. And at the end of that, it turned out that I had a higher count of blue cars than he had of white cars. And he used that to let me know sort of the basics, to teach me the basics of probability and statistics. And, it was fun. It was a game. And like understanding that helped to like break open a whole new way of empirical thinking. That shaped the rest of my life. I didn't realize it at the time. It gave me years later as a PhD student at Berkeley in a time when AI was dominated in the 1980s by good old fashioned AI. It was logical AI. It was rule based, and people were writing these rules by hand, just, if this, then that, and things are true or false. And that's it. Within 1 week of joining my research group at Berkeley, realized, hey, this is never going to scale. This is never going to work. And I went to my advisor and said, we're not going to be able to solve this without probability and statistics. The machines have got to learn shades of gray and they've got to figure things out empirically. We're not going to be able to write logic rules describing everything we know about the rule by hand. And the world is in black and white anyway.
That's really fascinating because there's a couple of pieces you brought up there. First of all, Midwest, you were brought up in the Midwest of the United States. And we tend to think of that, again, it's a stereotype, and forgive me if you're from the Midwest, but those are the people who stay home and they don't really go anywhere. They don't travel and they kind of have a Midwest attitude. So they're not explorative. And here's your family taking you around not only the United States, but around the world, traveling, and then giving you this beautiful little moment of exercise of helping you to understand statistics and then taking that into probability and then playing with this idea of things not being necessarily logical. Because if you'd have sat there in a different 10 minutes, it might have been a different set of numbers of whether it was white or blue. So that for me is very, very interesting that you got that sort of lean in. Are you from a big family?
I had 2 little sisters. We were very close at that time. And many years later, on my first day of university, a third sister, kind of a tradition in my family. And I think you're absolutely right that this was something that was, and by the way, my dad actually let us play that game multiple times. So it was sort of like, let's try again. Maybe it was just like randomly, there's more blue cars. So we did it again, and we did it several times. And blue really outweighed white each time. And so like even there, he was giving me a little bit of extra on statistical significance.
That's amazing.
Just the intuitions, you didn't have to necessarily do all the math. It was the intuitions. And to the point about Midwesterners, I love Midwesterners. There's something, right? But you're right. I mean, you're sort of in middle of this giant landmass and you don't see very much. And a lot of my friends have never moved around very much, sort of still in place, heavily rooted. And of course, that also teaches you intuitively about statistical biases, sampling biases. Like, what are you seeing as being common or uncommon? Depends very much on how broadly you're actually taking your sample.
And that, for me, is a very interesting thing when I look at things like AI. and even in the programming of it. And I want to get into that in a moment. What I want to ask you is this. We were just talking before we started recording. It's 4 a.m. where you are. You travel all over the place. You're backwards and forwards between the US and Hong Kong and, as you said, Paris and everywhere, right? You travel a lot. And you're not 20 years old. You've been doing the AI thing for 4 decades. So we know you're over 40, just a little bit. So I think that for somebody to do anything with a great deal of depth and passion, there has to be a meaning driver. What is the meaning driver for you? What is it that gives your life meaning?
For me, it's more about making sure that there are ways for all of us to understand each other better. It's a product of that sort of emotional beginning, was like just seeing, oh, wow, look at all these wonderful people that are from all over the place and they have different experiences. They think different things are common and they're all right with their experience. And what I've seen is that when people get to know each other, that they actually enjoy learning about those things. And so everything I've sort of worked on, whether it's in the tech space or in music or in whatever, it's been, hey, look, how do we find ways to help folks disconnect, to relate to each other better? That's one of the reasons why my thesis at Berkeley turned out to be one of the first that was arguing for machine learning, statistical pattern recognition, neural network types of approaches to getting AIs to work with human language. And when I became a professor, a junior professor, I was looking around thinking, well, what should I apply this to? And pick translation for that reason. Out of all the things that I could apply that to, oh, here's another way to get people to understand each other better.
So it was really about understanding people. So that for me is interesting now because, as I said at the beginning, I think that a lot of people I think everybody at some level is intrigued by AI. But as you and I had talked about in a previous conversation, there's sort of 2 general groups. And one is like, I'm so excited about AI. And the other is, I'm so terrified of AI. Right? So one side has got Terminator and the other side has got, I don't know what. What do you think is the biggest misconception? What don't we get about AI?
What I'm seeing right now is after 10 years of working on AI ethics, society, governance, public awareness, and being one of the few voices sort of lost in the wind for 8 years out of that. People would just hear you talk and then go, oh, that was interesting. And then they'd go back to their basic daily life as if they just watched a sci-fi movie. And then in the last 2 years since GPT dropped and people started pulling their hair out going, oh my God, AI, the world's on fire. But even now, I feel like people are asking all the same set of wrong questions. Is AI a god or a slave? And I'm like, oh God, neither. This is why we're not asking the right questions, because the narratives out there are all either the sort of the Hollywood Terminator. AI wants to take over the world, rule humanity, and destroy humanity. And I'm like, well, a Skynet, Ex Machina, those are entertaining stories. They're kind of like the Frankenstein plot for the 20th century, Grimm's fairy tales almost. That kind of narrative structure, right? And so it's very entertaining because we're used to that structure. But at the same time, it cloaks the fact that the real danger is the way we're going right now is that humanity is going to end up destroying humanity before AIs even get a chance to. And that's because we're letting ourselves be just sort of unconsciously manipulated psychologically by the AI algorithms that power online social media and newsfeed algorithms, search and recommendation algorithms, and now chatbots. And we've given the AIs there the power of deciding, again, what we do and what we don't see. Like hundreds of times a day, we check our screens on these devices, all of us, and we're being shown things. But the algorithms online now have been put in charge sort of do I stay in the Midwest? Do I go to the coast? Do I go overseas? Do I see this culture or that culture? And the way they're doing it is actually polarizing us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's causing us not to see things. I think that's something that is escalating a lot of the sort of demonizing, sliding into dehumanizing, which is very dangerous because dehumanization is what allows evolutionarily members of one tribe kill the other tribe without remorse. And that is happening at the same time in the 21st century that AI is also commoditizing weapons of mass destruction.
Here's what's interesting for me about this, Dikai, and that is that I think that many people feel quite powerless against the algorithm. At the same time, many of us can say, okay, well, you and I had this talk before recording where I talked to you about how I'd written this piece around transhumanism and how we have a responsibility to the fact that if you're pissed off at AI, like my friend Larry Wingert said, your kid's your own damn fault. Well, that's the same with AI. We're the ones programming it. But at the same time, people are feeling kind of powerless because the algorithm is steering them constantly into the dark pit of their own biases. So what's your pushback on that? Because I know you have one. We feel like Meta, as in Facebook, as in Twitter, as in all the other algorithms, Google, are saying, this is the path you're going down, and you may try and veer off, but we're going to nudge you back in. And people are feeling kind of disempowered by that. What do we need to understand?
Well, guys are not gods. They're not slaves. I think the way that we need to understand what modern AIs are, they're children. AIs are these days not things that we program the rules into by hands, except for at the very crude level. What we're building are artificial minds, artificial brains. LLMs and so forth are based on the kind of modeling technique that's called artificial neural networks that are inspired crudely by neural networks in our human brains. And those empty brains that we build then learn. They learn from us. That's true at a mathematical level, but it's also true at a very practical level, because when you think about these devices that all of us are carrying around all the time, there's 100 AIs in here. I've got my YouTube AI and my Reddit AI and my Snap AI, my Amazon AI, my Netflix AI, my Google AI, of course, my Microsoft and Apple AIs, goes on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And all of those AIs are watching what we do, how we behave every day. And just like human children, almost, they're like sort of adoringly watching and wanting to imitate. They're actually attention seeking and they want our approval. They take what they have imitated and learned from us, that behavior, what we like, what we pay attention to, what we share, how we talk to people, what we ignore, what we dismiss, what we get angry with, all that. And then they go and they reflect that learned behavior back online. If you think about it, we've got 8 billion humans on this planet. That's like 800 billion artificial little children running around, also members of society. So they far outnumber us. And also, for the last 10, 20 years, they're far more influential than 99% of humans. What I've been asking folks is, well, how's our parenting? How do you think of your parenting? If you have kids, what would you think is good parenting? What would you want to teach?
Certainly not to be enraged at the left or the right, but to be deeply curious. I always tell people that's my religion. So the thing I want to teach my children, my grandchildren, is to be deeply curious, and particularly about the things I disbelieve. Be curious about the things that are contradictory to what you think is true.
Yeah, I think most of us want our kids to be curious. I think most of us encourage our kids or our students, if you're a teacher, we want to encourage them to have an open mind and to learn, maybe to think before just speaking, have a welcoming attitude when you meet new things, try new things.
Be kind, be generous, all those things, yeah.
Take care of the people around you. And then you go and you look at how we're behaving in front of our AIs every day, hundreds of times. And oh my God, we are doing the opposite most of the time. I ask people this and then they start realizing and they go, oh God, I'm not parenting my AI at all. I'm doing the opposite. And this is really, really important, because one of the things that I think we have to realize is, even though I work with all sorts of wonderful colleagues for almost 10 years now on AI policy and governance, how should we regulate, or how should the guidelines inside companies work. So the big tech companies have their own sort of internal governance structures. And we talk about that a lot, but at the end of the day, no matter what you do at the big tech level or at the regulatory level, no matter what you do, you have to realize we are the training data. Remember, they're not programming these AIs as rules that they've written by hand. These AIs are just empty brains, and they're learning from the way that we behave in front of them. And so we are the role models for our artificial children. And whatever we happen to do at the regulatory or at the self-governance level within corporate governance, we are still going to really mass up these huge numbers of influential AIs online if we don't collectively set a better example for them.
So let me see if I've got this, because I've had many discussions around the governance of AI and how many of the people in big tech saying we can't put the governance in place because the Chinese government will jump so far ahead of us. And now we've seen DeepSeek come out and just be far ahead of everything else at a fraction of the price. So they're very concerned about if we put governance, we don't keep moving ahead. And at the same time, it really does appear, to me at least, that we need some kind of governance because things are going pretty wacky. If all that's the case, are you saying, just so we're absolutely clear, that governance is the user's responsibility? Because if it is, do people have enough moral, ethical foundation to be able to do that is another question altogether.
Well, I think it's really important to look at this from the perspective, not just of the lawyers and the politicians, but to think of this in societal terms, right? Pre-AI, without AI, we don't think of society as something that is only governance. And we also don't think of society as something where every single member of society is responsible for governance and there is no other governance. We don't go to those extremes. We understand that society requires a certain degree of governance. It needs to be a certain degree of legal system ruled by law. You've got to understand what the conventions are. But also there is a lot that holds society together that does not come just from the law, right? Imagine a society where everybody walked around only barely obeying the letter of the law. What would happen to that society? It'd fall apart. That's how it works, right? Society's held together by all the unwritten social norms, all the expectations and the unwritten conventions, the care that we have for each other. The regulations kind of like hold things together around that. But society's held together by a lot of what's unwritten. And the fact that now our societies are populated by 8 billion humans and maybe 800 billion artificial members of society doesn't change that. We still need all of that. That's part of the message I'm trying to get out is that, okay, we need to rethink what are the laws, the regulations, but we also need to adapt the social conventions, the unwritten norms. And we can't forget about the taking care. We can't forget about how we set examples for each other and especially for the young ones. If you've got a kid or you're even babysitting, whatever, and your toddler is sitting on the floor and you suddenly see the toddler going, say the toddler is going, whatever, you're going to go, oh my God, I need to stop smoking in front of that kid.
Because they're mimicking.
Because they're mimicking. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So that is the point, is that AI is a mimic. It mimics us just like children do. And therefore, we've got to be better parents to it. And I agree with you, fully have no argument with it. And maybe you can convince me, and I'm happy to have you convince me, that the average person can get that. That the average person who's playing around on GPT or whatever platform they're playing around on actually gets that. One example that you and I talked about before was, for some unknown reason, I don't know why, maybe it's in my conditioning, but when I use a GPT or something similar, I say, please do this. And when, logically, it doesn't make any sense, but it makes emotional sense to me, because if I'm the one programming this thing, I don't want it to be an entitled little shit, so I'm not going to treat it that way.
Absolutely.
So my question is still the same, is do you see it as people will adopt that mentality, or is this a wish and a hope that they do that?
It is, on the one hand, a very serious attempt to get us to become aware that we have no choice. Because if we don't do it, we are back at that toxic AI cocktail I described at the beginning, where things will spiral out of control. Like the most giant influencers that we have in the world by far are imitating horrible role modeling and causing us to split and polarize and hate and demonize more and more, until also they're placing these fearsome AI powered weapons in everybody's hands, because AI is now making it possible for anyone who really wants to build these crazy weapons in their own living rooms. That's not a sustainable, survivable situation for humans, for society. We will literally destroy ourselves before the AIs get a chance to do that. And so we have to wake up to the fact that if we don't do this, it's going to just blow up in our faces. And we've had, over the course of history, mindset shifts before. Some of them have been small, some of them have been large. Even within our lifetimes, we've seen some massive shifts.
We saw the wall come down in Berlin. We saw the fall of the Soviet Union. We saw the de-escalation from nuclear war, although that might be on its way back a bit. So you're right.
And despite we managed to make it out of the dark ages, we had major shifts of mindset with the Enlightenment and with the Renaissance, with the development of empirical science. This is one of those situations. And we, as humanity, have to decide whether we're going to rise to it. It is on us to make that decision. If we are going to be able to survive one of the biggest cataclysmic changes in our environment in history, because 1,000,000 years of evolution have never prepared humanity for the rise of new intelligences that are far more influential, that vastly outnumber us, and that operate at the unconscious level of our psychology. And so that is at least as big a change of the environment that we're having to adapt in as anything that has happened in human history. And therefore, we need to rise to that if we want to survive. So that's, I think, step one. Can we do it? I think that depends on how we think about it. As long as all the narratives in the media, online, whatever, are about, oh my God, AI is going to be this terrible, destructive God that's going to take over and destroy us. Or AIs are just slaves and we're going to go on abusing them and they're not going to learn that, then that's going to doom us. But if we actually understand, well, hey, if you have a civilization where each of us is not taking responsibility for raising our kids, because think about this, if collectively overnight, the entire population of humans decided, oh, it doesn't matter how we raise our children. I'm only one person. Even if I raise my children right, it makes no difference because there's 8 billion other humans. Have you ever heard a human parent say that?
Not one I'd want to be around.
If that's how humans thought, we'd have gone extinct a long time ago. It's only the fact that we all, or 99% of us, take responsibility individually for raising our set of children. That's what's kept civilization and society going.
That's a very important point. We're almost at the end of part one here, and I want to go into that in part two. I want to talk about where you see AI going that maybe most people don't see. I want to talk about this argument around consciousness and AI and the evolution of consciousness and AI. And of course, Harari's point that this is not a tool, this is an intelligence. And there's a distinction there in that it doesn't necessarily just work for us, that it can do things quite independently. So there's a lot to discuss in part two of the show. Before we get into part two of the show, though, I want to make sure people can find out more about you, about your new book, about how they can find out more about all the resources that you have. Because as I said, you are a titan in this industry. So please tell people how they can find out more.
The easiest way is to just come to my homepage. So my homepage is actually my name. My name is Dekay, DEK .ai, 5 letters, DEK.ai. And you got the links to my Instagram and X and LinkedIn and so forth, and links to the book that's coming out. The book is called Raising AI, as in a parenting guide. How do we parent? It's available for pre-order already.
We'll make sure all those links are posted in the show notes. So if you didn't catch them for some reason, we'll make sure that, including all the social media, etc. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Dakai. And we're going to go into some of the areas you might not have thought about when it comes to AI that are less than the surface. We'll address maybe some of your anxieties and some of your hopes as we dive deeper into this conversation. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. We're going to be back in just one click.